Good morning. My name is Ranger Chelsea. Thank you for joining us today. On behalf of the South Carolina State Park Service, the National Park Service, and the United States Forest Service, we thank you and we're excited that you're joining us for our virtual campout. All the 47 state parks in South Carolina are still closed, so we are happy you're able to join us virtually. We're going to continue to offer many programs online and via our social media platforms. Today we are at Redcliffe Plantation State Historic Site. Once again, I'm Ranger Chelsea, and this is one of the 3 plantation sites in the South Carolina State Park System. We are here in Beach Island, South Carolina, on the western part of the state. This site was active from 1855 when James Henry Hammond first purchased the site through 1975 when it becomes a state park. James Henry Hammond was a former South Carolina governor and a United States Senator. And he owned 4 plantations, actually. This was his last and smallest plantation of those 4. The 3 others are within about a 10-mile radius of Redcliffe. And across those 4 plantations, he actually owned 15,000 acres. Redcliffe was 400 acres. Today, as a state park, we still have most of that acreage. And across those 4 plantations, James Henry Hammond owned around 300 enslaved laborers at any given time. Here at Redcliffe, we know about 25 to 50 enslaved workers who would have been forced to live here. We're going to dive deeper into this site, into Redcliffe's history and those enslaved peoples that lived here. But first, we're going to head over to a separate park, another plantation site, and this program is actually going to cover 2 parks within the South Carolina State Park Service. Thank you, and I'll see you back here in a bit.
Thank you, Ranger Chelsea. Welcome to Rose Hill Plantation State Historic Site. My name is Ranger Stephanie, and I am one of the park rangers here at Rose Hill Plantation State Historic Site, located in Union, South Carolina. Rose Hill is the former home of William Henry Gist. William Henry Gist was the governor of South Carolina right before the Civil War and was known as the secession governor. This was about a 2,000-acre cotton and corn plantation through much of the 1800s and was home to not just William Henry Gist and his family, but up to 178 enslaved individuals who were forced to live and labor here to make Gist plantation very profitable. Now, as far as things we're going to talk about today, this is about a virtual campout. So we're going to talk about some stories. Who doesn't like stories at a campout? But these are the stories we're going to tell are true tales. Stories of enslaved individuals who try to make their way to freedom. Freedom seekers. You may have heard them called runaways. These were runaways, but they were seeking freedom. Now, we're going to tell you about some of these true tales of freedom seekers from Rose Hill Plantation and at Redcliffe. Before we start talking about these true tales, though, we're going to tell you a little about plantation life and how it was for enslaved individuals. Unfortunately, at Rose Hill Plantation here, we don't have that much official documentation, first-hand documentation, so we're going to head right back over to Redcliffe, who has some really good documentation to tell you about plantation life. So over to you, Chelsea.
Thank you, Stephanie. Here at Redcliffe Plantation, we're extremely fortunate of how much documentation has survived. One of those main primary sources that we use is the Plantation Manual. Pretty much every plantation would have had a plantation manual. We're just fortunate that ours has survived. And this was written by James Henry Hammond. I'm holding a copy here. And it's basically his rule book or guidebook for how he expects his plantation to be run. And it's mainly addressed to his overseer. A lower class white male that would have held that position and ran the plantation in his absence, because Hammond or any owner of any plantation isn't always going to be there at the location. They might be somewhere else, and the overseer is making sure the business and the work still gets done. So using this document, we're able to learn about the lives of the enslaved, what their day-to-day life would have been like, what work consisted of, what they got to eat, how much they had to grow or pick each day or cultivate. So we use this to learn about the lives of the enslaved. One of those things we'll talk about first, because we're just going to go over the basics of what life was like on a plantation. One of the first things we'll cover is shelter. So I'm standing here in one of the remaining slave cabins. There were originally 4 here at Redcliffe Plantation, and it's one room on this side. So there are 2 rooms that door that you're going to see to the right connects to the other side. As far as we know, that door wouldn't have been there during the time of slavery, so you have a separate section here for a family and a separate section on the other side without that connection between the two. But you'll notice this is just one room. So this is your kitchen, this is your living room, your dining room, your bedroom. There's not a lot of privacy here. Anywhere from 5 to 10 enslaved individuals would have lived in this space. They may have been your family, they may have been other workers that you're not related to. So that kind of gives you a picture of what your shelter or home would have looked like if you were an enslaved person here. We also know what food allotments were from the Plantation Manual. So once a week, these were weekly food allotments. Hammond allowed his slaves to be given a peck of cornmeal. So a few jars of cornmeal, and then 3 pounds of bacon or pickled pork. That's your weekly allotment. You've got to make that last throughout the week. Now we're missing something big here, and that's vegetables or fruits. James Henry Hammond would have allowed his enslaved individuals, and this is common across other plantations, to have a vegetable patch. Hammond allowed 1 per cabin. So they would have been allowed to grow their own vegetables, but those vegetable gardens can only be tended to outside of work hours. So we're going to go over work hours now, and you're going to see that doesn't leave a lot of time to tend to their own gardens. So we know what work hours were from the Plantation Manual as well. And work hours were essentially sun up to sundown. And you got a break at noon for an hour. Unless it was summer, then that break might go from 1 to 2 or 3 hours each day. And work ended at sunset. And the enslaved individuals would have had a couple hours to visit with others, spend in their gardens before the horn blow at night, where they are not allowed out of their cabins, their shelters, until work starts the next day. What does that work consist of? Well, here, or at James Henry Hammond's plantations in general, it's primarily picking cotton, cultivating cotton. So here we have a small bale. This is just about 13 pounds. So this is just a fraction of what would have been expected to be picked each day. We have records from Hammond of how much was picked each day. And children starting around the age of 9, they enter the fields, and they're picking about 100 pounds, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more. Yes, children at the age of 9, picking about 8 of these in a single day. And that's going to increase as those enslaved individuals get older, and when they're adults, that's over 200 pounds. That's continuing to rise. You don't get to pick a lot each day and then not as much the next day. So that's what work is looking like if you're an enslaved individual here, and any children you have. You know what their future looks like here too. It's also that same sun up to sundown work, those same food allotments, the same shelter. The last thing we're going to cover is punishments. James Henry Hammond has a page specifically devoted to punishments here in his Plantation Manual, so I'm just going to read the following. The following is the order in which offenses must be estimated and punished. Number 1, running away. 2, getting drunk or having spirits. 3, stealing hogs. 4, stealing. 5, leaving plantation without permission. 6, absence from house after horn blow at night. 7, unclean house or person. 8, neglect of tools. And 9, neglect of work. The highest punishment must not exceed 100 lashes in 1 day. To that extent, only in extreme cases. The whiplash must be 1 inch in width, or a strap of 1 thickness of leather 1.5 inches in width, and never severely administered. In general, 15 to 20 lashes will be a sufficient flogging. The hands in every case must be secured by a cord. Punishment must always be given calmly and deliberately, and never when angry or excited. So I'll recount his number 1 offense was running away. We know from further writings from Hammond that for his punishments for running away, he lets his enslaved individuals know that the whippings or the lashings can vary, and it's up to the enslaved individual of what that punishment is going to be. And what I mean by that is Hammond lets his slaves know that if they come back on their own, they receive 3 lashes for every day they're gone. If they are captured and have to forcibly be brought back, they receive 10 lashes for every day that they're gone. So he lets them remember that. Because to Hammond, or to a lot of plantation owners, it's about the money. These enslaved individuals are worth more to him if they come back on their own than if they starve out in the woods and potentially don't survive because they're gone for so long and then receive a more harsh whipping. So keep that in mind. That's all for the Plantation Manual. We do have several other documents that we use from James Henry Hammond, and those are the Plantation Journals. These are day-to-day observances that Hammond writes down that tell us what's happening on the plantation that day, how the crop was that day, what work some of the enslaved individuals did, if there was an incident or something bad happened, or what slaves were born or died or got married. We use these for a lot of different things, and we learn a lot of different information from the Plantation Journals. We are using them today to learn about several instances of enslaved individuals who are brave enough to seek their freedom. So we're going to refer to them as freedom seekers, or those who try to self-emancipate, or those who run away from the plantation. And we learn about several instances of these from the Plantation Journals. So we're going to look at that next. Okay. The first enslaved individual that we're going to talk about is Alonso. And Alonso attempted to obtain his freedom twice, actually. Alonso was purchased by James Henry Hammond in 1843, and shortly thereafter, Hammond arranged for Alonso to marry another enslaved individual, Maggie Campbell. By early 1844, Alonso and Maggie have their first child, who unfortunately does not survive. She dies very early on, shortly after childbirth. And shortly after that death, Maggie Campbell, Alonso's wife, dies as well. Perhaps Alonso saw this as the opportune time to seek his freedom. But shortly after Maggie's death, Alonso goes on the run. He leaves Hammond's plantations, and he makes it as far as Savannah. He escapes in April and makes it to Savannah in 1844. But we have records that Alonso was captured in Savannah and jailed there before being returned to James Henry Hammond's possession. Why did he go to Savannah? Probably because it's a port city. And that would have been an easier route to freedom up to the north by being able to jump on a ship, potentially undetected, rather than trying to go on foot up through the north. So he heads to Savannah. Unfortunately, he's captured the following month, and he's brought back to Hammond. And Hammond, as a punishment, we see that he actually puts Alonso in chains, puts him in irons, he says, as punishment. Well, that doesn't stop Alonso or sway him at all. He escapes again for a second time while in chains. He's not gone as long that second attempt. He's gone for almost a month the first time. The second time in chains, he's gone almost 2 weeks. And when he is brought back and captured, he does not have the chains on anymore. So he somehow got out of those. Unfortunately, Alonso did not make it to permanent freedom, and he does not survive to emancipation either, despite his fighting spirit. He passes away in August of 1864 to an illness. We're going to talk about another couple individuals who were seeking their freedom, and that's Marcus and Hannah Smith. This was actually a married couple who escaped together. Marcus left first in 1832. He ran away in April, just like Alonso had run away in April, and he was gone for 7 months. Hannah joins him 2 months later in June, and they both return on their own volition in October. So think about that. They're gone from either April or June through October. That's the height and the bulk of the cotton picking season. That was very intentional on them. So they may not have even planned on trying to get permanent freedom, being away permanently. Hammond notes that he thinks Marcus and Hannah stayed in a nearby swamp the entire time they were gone, but perhaps they just continued to evade capture because when they came back, it was on their own. They weren't captured and brought back in October of that same year. So yes, they didn't obtain permanent freedom, but for months they were together alone out there, even though it was in the wilderness. That's some type of freedom compared to the cabin that we looked at here. Living with a group of people with no privacy, living under the lash every day, having to pick cotton in the height of the summer. So they did have a semblance of freedom, even if it was short-lived. Marcus does not survive to emancipation. He passes away in 1857. Hannah, we have conflicting accounts of whether or not she makes it to emancipation. Some records say she died. Some say that she's still around in 1864. And then emancipation is that following year. But it's important to note also that Marcus and Hannah had several children, but they made this attempt at freedom before they had any children. And that's quite common. Hammond purposely wanted his enslaved individuals to marry and have children because he knew that it lowered the risk of them running away. It's a very dangerous, difficult journey to take a child on or to take in a group. So if you're married and have a family, that's a much higher risk than many of these enslaved individuals would be willing to take, knowing that their children or as a group they could be harmed, and it would just be a more difficult trip. The last individual we're going to talk about, though we know there are about 50 attempts amongst freedom seekers under James Henry Hammond's possession. The last we're going to talk about is a young girl named Philpy. I wanted to talk about Philpy because she's the youngest enslaved person who sought their freedom, who was owned by James Henry Hammond. And Philpy was only about 15 when she ran away. And she ran away in July. Once again, that's the height of the cotton picking season. We don't know if that's why she ran, because the level of work was increased and the heat, the labor was more difficult at that time. We don't know if that's why. We're just speculating. But she's gone for about 2 weeks. And then she comes back on her own, I believe. And Philpy, unlike the other ones we've mentioned before, Philpy does survive to emancipation. With the ratification of the 13th Amendment and the end of the Civil War in 1865, Philpy does see that. So she doesn't get independence or freedom when she attempts that journey on her own, but she does live to see permanent freedom with the end of the Civil War in 1865. So those are just a few of the freedom seekers that we have at Redcliffe Plantation, though there are many more accounts that we're not going to get to today. But we're going to head back over to Rose Hill with Ranger Stephanie, and she's going to share some information on the freedom seekers from that site. Thanks, we'll see you back here in a bit.
Thank you, Ranger Chelsea. It's Ranger Stephanie again, and we are currently off Rose Hill Plantation. We are in Sumter National Forest, and we're located about a mile away from where William Henry Gist's plantation would have been located. We got permission from the Forest Service to come out here, and we are currently right next to Fair Forest Creek, which has some interesting things to do with some of our freedom seekers from Rose Hill. You may notice I'm missing my hat. Unfortunately, because of all the leaf cover, the camera was having a little issue, so I'm going to do this segment without my hat, even though I'm outside. Just wanted to let you know. So I want to tell you a little about some of our freedom seekers from Rose Hill Plantation. The one that we definitely know of is Jack Gist. Sometime in the 1850s, we're not exactly sure when, a teenage Jack Gist decided to attempt to emancipate himself. Now, we don't know exactly when he fled the plantation. It could have been in the dark of the night. It could have been that he was laboring and toiling in the fields and waited for that exact precise moment to make a run for the forest. Or it could have been that he was on a day pass to town with the permission of William Henry Gist to retrieve some items, and he used that time to make his bid for freedom. It could have been many things. We don't know, but at some point, Jack Gist decided to attempt to self-emancipate himself, seek freedom. And he came to Fair Forest Creek, that's where we are right now. You see the water behind us. We don't know exactly where Jack Gist hid, but he hid right near Fair Forest Creek for about 5 months. He found, according to some testimonies, a cave. Now, we don't know if this cave was actually a natural land formation, like a gully, or that was caused by erosion, or if Jack dug himself a cave. But we have a little behind us, and we're going to swing the camera around for you to see a natural land formation, a gully, something that Jack Gist may have hidden. I'm going to let you take a look there. This is just an example, of course. We don't know where exactly along Fair Forest Creek Jack hid himself for 5 months, but he was able to hide himself. And during the time, that 5 months, Jack was in hiding and free, he managed to acquire, sometimes through stealing potentially, but a lot of times he was able to get stuff from other enslaved individuals. He acquired 2 geese, a few chickens, 2 middles of meat, and 1 hog, along with other provisions. This helped him survive. He hid out here, and he survived for those 5 months, probably going out mostly at night, but he made his own schedule, as during those 5 months, he was somewhat free. Then one night, when Jack was using a log to cross the Fair Forest Creek River, he met Anderson, who was another enslaved individual of William Henry Gist. They chatted for a little while, and then both went on their way. Jack going to do his own thing, and then eventually coming back to his cave formation that he was hiding out in. Unfortunately for Jack, Anderson decided to tell William Henry Gist where Jack was hiding. And the following day, William Henry Gist and some other white men came and retrieved Jack from his cave. Jack was punished, he was whipped, and he was put back to work. But for 5 months, Jack was free. He was stuck in the cave and he had to watch his footing and where he was going, so he wasn't caught, but he did have control of his life in a way. So he had self-emancipated himself. Unfortunately, he didn't make it all the way to freedom for the rest of his life. We don't know what happened to Jack Gist after he was put back into slavery. We have no records of if he made it to freedom, if he made it to the end of the Civil War and got to see freedom again, but we do know that Jack, for a time period, was free. We do have 3 other instances that may have been enslaved individuals at Rose Hill Plantation who try to seek freedom. We don't know for sure, though, because they're not as well detailed as Jack's story. We know of Nelson. In 1846, Nelson was found dead. He was along a road that went from Fair Forest Creek to Rose Hill, which is only about a mile away, as I mentioned. He was found by an overseer, and the coroner's report said that Nelson had on him 2 bottles of whiskey, 1 empty, 1 half full, pair of pantaloons, jean pantaloons, some different yarn spinning, and a few different things. This was all noted by the coroner's report, and the coroner said that Nelson appeared to have died from being out late on a Sunday night, or whatever brought him out on a Sunday night was what killed him. Excuse me there. Now, we don't know exactly what killed Nelson, unfortunately. It could have been the overseer himself. Was Nelson trying to escape freedom? We don't know. He may have been trading some of the things that he had on him. But for whatever reason, whoever found him may have been the one to cause Nelson's demise. But even if he wasn't seeking freedom, he was exercising what little freedom he had. Because if he was coming out to Fair Forest Creek at night to trade goods or do what he wanted, he was doing something that he probably shouldn't have done. It was probably something that the Gist family did not want him doing, but he did it anyways. Unfortunately, it didn't work out very well for Nelson, and he perished from that. Another instance of a person, an enslaved individual at Rose Hill, that may have attempted to escape was Tom. In 1861, this is November 1861, the Civil War has already started. Tom was recorded as of dying on the Broad River. He was on a boat, and he fell off the boat and drowned in a fish dam trap. It was very cold out. He may have frozen to death before drowning. We're not sure. We don't know what Tom was doing on that boat. He may have been on that boat to deliver cotton to Columbia or coming back. He may have been trying to escape, try to make his way to freedom. But unfortunately, Tom did not make it to freedom. He perished on that river. And the Fair Forest Creek that we're at right now leads into the Tiger River, which leads to the Broad River. So Tom does have some relation to this river in a way. And the last instance of an enslaved individual we know of at Rose Hill that may have been trying to make their bid for freedom was Joseph. In the early years of Rose Hill Plantation, in 1828, Joseph is noted as having died trying to cross the Fairforest Creek right here near William Rice's Ford, which may have been just right around here. He died crossing the river. Unfortunately, we don't know what caused his demise, if he drowned, if there were other reasons. The coroner's report was not big on giving us many details. But he is another one who did not make his way to freedom, if he was even trying to seek freedom. So we know of Jack Gist, who definitely tried to escape. He hid away for 5 months before he was recaptured. The other individuals, we don't know if they were trying to make their way to freedom, if they were freedom seekers, but they may have been. And there's a lot of possibility there were other individuals at Rose Hill Plantation who tried to escape, who tried to self-emancipate. And then across the United States, there were numerous accounts of enslaved individuals trying to flee where they were enslaved. Some of them hid like Jack Gist, but some of them made their way northwest, really trying to find a place where they could be free without having to hide. I'm going to head you back to Chelsea to talk a little about how some of these individuals who tried to escape, and some of them did make it, were able to survive, feed themselves as they made their escapes. How do they live off the land? We know Jack Gist was able to acquire things like geese and a hog, but not all individuals were staying in one place, so they would have to forage the land. So, over to you, Chelsea.
Thanks, Stephanie. So we are outside, obviously, next to this giant prickly pear at Redcliffe, and I'm going to talk about some foods that would have been available for those living off the land here, or if one of those enslaved individuals was on the run and they were looking for something to eat for nourishment. There's a lot of options here in South Carolina at Redcliffe, same at Rose Hill, and just throughout the area. Now, there's a lot more than what I'm going to cover as well, but I kind of chose things that didn't need to be cooked, because there's a lot of plants that you can eat but maybe need to be cooked or boiled so that they're not toxic. I'm not covering those. I'm kind of just working with what I was able to find, and some of the things that are in season. I've got a few things that aren't in season too. But if you're one of those enslaved individuals living off the land, you're on the run, you're trying to get some nourishment, maybe you're not working with some of the enslaved peoples still under the slave owners' control. Some of those who ran away might have been given food constantly if they were in the woods nearby, and nourishment that way. But we're looking at options if you need extra food from the land itself. So we've got some greens out here. It's amazing how much you can just eat when you're walking around. I didn't know this. Wood sorrel is a green that you can eat. I really like this, and I just discovered it like a week ago. You'll be able to identify it with the really distinct heart-shaped petals. And you can eat the whole thing on this. I'd like it with some goat cheese on a cracker, but you can just eat it on its own. It's got kind of like a nice sour taste. Another type of sorrel, I think this is called sheep sorrel sometimes, but it's got a red leaf. There's some things in here with thorns, and I don't have gloves on. So this is my red sorrel. I'm gonna put my basket down. It's super wilted, so because I picked it too early before the program. But normally these flowers are standing upright, and it's pretty distinct, the color, so you can see this out in the field. But this also has a slightly sour taste, and you can eat this as well. You can eat the whole stem and the flower, in fact. Do your own research on a lot of these though, the best way to cook them or eat these, because you can use a lot of these in seasoning. But once again, we're thinking of those who are on the run, trying to eat anything just to get some nourishment for survival, not for delicious cooking, though it can be used for that. So this is your sheep sorrel. This is a type of red sorrel. The first thing I went over was wood sorrel, and another green we have are dandelions. So dandelions are actually edible as well, easily identified with the yellow flower. You can eat the flower and the stem and the leaves. I think my leaves fell off, but they're these longer leaves. And people make dandelion wine, I think, out of the flower. I haven't tried that. I'm down for it though. But this is edible too. I never would have thought that it was. Now we also have some berries. So there's a lot more berries than what I'm going to go over, but blackberries are what me and my manager were able to find around the site. And they're thorny, so you want to wear gloves when you're picking these, but they're usually identified from the white flower. It usually has 5 petals. This flower looks very sad. Almost all the flowers were gone when I went to pick these, but normally you'll see a ton of these flowers, and from the flower the blackberry grows. And they usually ripen in June or July, maybe May, but into June. And they grow out of that flower, and they start out green, and then they turn red. See, this thing is thorny, it's sticking to me. You see some of the berries here. Then they turn red, and then they're black when they are ripe. So you can kind of see some of these berries here. So if you see these out in your own yard and you want to pick them, just be sure to have gloves on. I thought I had more in here, I guess not. Vines, we can cover vines next. There's a lot of not vines, excuse me, these are vines. Wild grapes is what I'm trying to say. But there's a lot of wild grapes that grow in South Carolina and in the Southeast in general. They don't really ripen, and they're not ready to eat until August or September. There's lots of varieties of muscadine, and they'll be a really dark purple, almost black when they're ready. And it should be really easy to pick off. Just if you touch them or move them a little too much, they'll fall off the vine when they're really ready to eat. And you can eat those raw. So this is what the vine leaves look like that the grapes themselves grow from. And I didn't realize you can actually eat grapevine leaves as well. So the leaves themselves are edible, and I think the vine is edible, I read somewhere too. Check that first. But you can eat these leaves as well as the grapes when they become in bloom. And you kind of see just the start of where these grapes would start to form. We have these all over Redcliffe. Let's see, let's do some, these are my favorite. Wild onions are all over this place. I didn't know this because we're usually cutting the grass all the time. Not cutting the grass as much, so we're seeing a lot more onions. So when you're walking around, you'll really see just from this part up on the landscape. So this thick kind of tubing is what tells you that there's an onion there. And they're pretty small. They won't grow a whole lot bigger. You can repot them, transplant them at your house, or let them go in the ground. They'll still be pretty small. And before you dig them up in the ground, because obviously you don't see from here below, if you're not sure if it's an onion and you want to check, you can actually just pick a piece off of the green and smell it. It smells really good. And then you get that strong garlicky or onion smell. And you can eat this part too. You can eat the actual onion, obviously, but this whole green root too you can eat. I'm gonna save these for later. I'm gonna wash them off, maybe use those. Now got 2 things left. Let's look at the black walnut. I'm gonna save the prickly pear for last. So we have black walnut tree here. There's a lot more trees that have nuts, but they usually fall in the fall, and it's April, so it's not really in season. We still had some black walnuts around the tree though, so I was able to gather these for the program. Now, these are edible, but they're really hard to get to, because normally the nut, which would have been in here, is covered like this. But then over this section too, there's a whole nother husk. This is just a little bit of that that's covering this nut. So when they fall from the tree, they're really big, and you have to go through a lot of layers to get down to the walnuts. So I love walnuts, but it's a lot of effort without tools to kind of get to. And the last thing that you see a lot in the Southeast that I'm going to go over today is the prickly pear, this giant cactus behind me. There's varieties of it all over the country. A lot in the Southwest you might see. But the little purple fruit on it is edible. You just got to get past the skin. So it's got this really cool, bright, like magenta color on the inside. And that inside is edible. You can take the seed, you can separate the seeds too if you want to strain the seeds out. But you can eat the inside here. But you have to be careful because it's a cactus. It's covered in spines. So because this one is super ripe, they really ripen up around August and September, maybe into October. The more ripe they get, some of those spines fall off naturally. But right when they're ready to pick and earlier on, they're covered with so many more spikes or spines. So you really need to be wearing thick gloves or even using tongs to pick those off if you're going to eat them. And then after, when you bring them home, you can remove, I think I have a spike in my hand. You can remove the spines with a knife or some kind of metal scrubbing object, or you can burn them off too, if you hold it over fire. But let your parents do that if you're a child. And then you can open it up, take off the skin, and scoop out the good meat on the inside. It tastes pretty good. I've had it a couple different ways. So prickly pears are native here too, and they would have been around, but difficult to pick and eat without gloves, which those enslaved on the run might not have had the proper gloves to get to them. So those are just a few of the edible items that we have here at Redcliffe. They would have been at Rose Hill Plantation as well. There's a lot more that would have been available. And keep in mind, the enslaved individuals, when they are getting away, trying to make it to the north to their freedom, they would have already known about these options because they would have supplemented their diet with these options, because we already went over what the food allotments were. There wasn't a lot there for them. So they would have on their own known about other edible plants, whether it's for medicinal use even, or just for eating, for supplementing their diet. But we're going to learn some more. We're going to head back over to Rose Hill Plantation with Ranger Stephanie, and she's going to tell us about what means the enslaved would have used when seeking their freedom to get where they're going. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Ranger Chelsea. Welcome back to Rose Hill, everybody. Now, Ranger Chelsea just talked to you a little about how freedom seekers, individuals, enslaved individuals who are trying to escape, run away, and find freedom, how they would forage the land, how they would survive off the land until they made it to freedom. Well, on their way to freedom, how did they know where they were going? So I'm going to tell you a little about how enslaved individuals may have used the stars to navigate their way to freedom up north and west, particularly up north. Behind me here I have a kind of part of the sky layout, and many individuals throughout history would use the stars to navigate their way, particularly the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper, which are always north. They'd find the North Star, which is located in the Little Dipper. So over here, and if you are looking at the night sky at night, it happens to be during the day now, but at night, if you look towards the north, you can sometimes find the North Star, which is a very bright star in the sky, and it is located right here. It's Polaris. Polaris is always going to be at the northernmost point, as of now. In 1,000 years, 10,000 years or so, I don't know the exact time, it's going to change. There's going to be a different North Star, but for now, it's Polaris. And if you can find the Big Dipper, which is located, it's pretty easy to find. There's normally different parts of it to find. You can see something that looks sort of like a spoon. You can find the Little Dipper, because if you find two very bright stars of the Big Dipper, you can go directly up and you hit the tail end of the Little Dipper. And this is the Little Dipper, and there is Polaris. Now, when looking for the Big Dipper to find the Little Dipper, enslaved individuals may have looked for a drinking gourd, a spoon. A gourd is squash, and if that is hollowed out, this is a good example of one. You hollow it out, it's dried out, and it could be used as like a bowl or spoon to drink water. If you found the drinking gourd, then you could follow it to freedom. There was even a song, not sure if it was sung during slavery times, during the antebellum period, but many people believe it may have been used to pass along messages. To escape to freedom, follow the drinking gourd. So if you follow the drinking gourd, which kind of looks like this, you follow your way north and you follow your way to freedom. That is a possibility, but the stars were great to kind of navigate their way to freedom. They were probably used a lot by Harriet Tubman on the Underground Railroad. We don't know if anybody here in South Carolina at Rose Hill and Redcliffe ever used the Underground Railroad to escape to freedom, but many enslaved individuals did. And enslaved individuals from Redcliffe and Rose Hill here may have used the stars to navigate their way. We're going to head back over to Redcliffe and to Ranger Chelsea to finish up. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and bye from Rose Hill.
Thank you, Stephanie. That wraps up our program here at Redcliffe and Rose Hill Plantation State Historic Sites. Today we looked at some of the stories regarding how, why, and when some of the enslaved individuals sought their freedom and left the plantations that they were forced to live and work at. Unfortunately, none of those enslaved individuals made it to permanent freedom from these brave attempts. Though they did gain some semblance of independence, even if it was just temporary, when they escaped the control of their owners. If this interests you, the lives of the enslaved, plantation history, these historic sites, please check out our South Carolina State Parks Facebook and YouTube pages. We have other programs we've uploaded, and there's definitely going to be more to come. Since South Carolina State Parks are still closed, please be on the lookout for more of these virtual programs, and we really look forward to seeing you in the future when we're back open in person. Just a reminder, there is still a state burn ban in effect, and that does include campfires. But the virtual campout is not over. We hope to see you at our next spot. We're heading to the beach, and I hope to see you there at Edisto Beach State Park. Thanks for joining us today.